I've played tons of Super Nintendo games, but the one genre that I've always avoided was sports games, because to me, their replayability was limited to how much of that particular sport you could tolerate before the next big same idea came out. In a previous episode, I tackled the NES best and worst sports games, and while that library was dummy thick, it wasn't nearly as dummy thick as the Super Nintendo, and I sat through 172 different Super Nintendo games, meticulously analyzing the things I liked about it and the things that I did not like about it. Now, this video was requested by Mr. What's It To Ya almost 11 months ago, and it took me a long time to finally get the chance to do this, so I do apologize for taking so long, and I hope you enjoy this video. Today, I'm going to talk about my top 10 best Super Nintendo sports games, and I want you all to understand that if your game isn't on this list, it does not mean that it's bad. It just didn't stand out to me in comparison to the other games. Take it with a grain of salt, and remember, I'm just a boy. With that being said, let's begin. Usually when I see gray matter games, I immediately stub my toe on the corner of the table to distract myself from the ass pain I'm about to experience. But this one, pretty solid little baseball game. Now, RBI itself, it's a legacy franchise. It actually started from Namco, the first being Pro Baseball Family Stadium or Pro Yakyu Family Stadium, and then it was localized to RBI Baseball by Tengen, aka Atari. You remember that stupid black cart that messes up your shelf flow? Yeah, those. After the release of that one, we had 3 more games before it hopped to the Super Nintendo. Even the Genesis had an RBI game before Nintendo did. We have all of the usual options, for example, Exhibition, Home Run Derby, Practice, Playoffs, League Play, and Game Breaker. Some people don't like the controls, but compared to some of the lackluster controls I dealt with during this journey, I don't think it's nearly as complicated as some of the others. If you want a good baseball game, Super RBI Baseball is exactly that. Well, we have our first football game. Now, for many of you who grew up during this era, there was one name in video gaming that mattered for football: John Madden. A franchise that still thrives to this day, and guess what? Not a single one of them are on this list. True story. In fact, this is the only football game on the Super Nintendo that I actually kind of liked. The rest were, I don't know, I guess the Genesis did it better. Ever heard of Sterling Sharpe, though? He played for the Green Bay Packers until his neck said, "No thank you." And that's a shame, because he was a pretty damn good wide receiver. The game does incorporate the 1993 NFL season, but they couldn't secure the rights for team names and logos. You can bet your ass Madden had something to do with that. And while many people consider this a subpar Madden clone, I actually enjoyed it far more than Madden. And there were like 5 of those fuckers on the Super Nintendo. To me, Tosei did a fine job, which is shocking because I usually hate Tosei. Their NES games were whack as whack can be, and thankfully this one wasn't. While it lacks a season mode, which is something most people might want in a football game, I still think that at face value, this game is solid. You might like it. I do have to give an honorable mention to Bill Walsh College Football. While it didn't have that many teams, 24 in total, I still found that it was pretty fun. That's something you'll see for a while when it comes to early college sports games. In some ways, they are limited in what they can handle when it came to the NCAA. EA Sports, as big as they were in the early 90s, couldn't nab the licensing rights for many schools, so instead, we were limited to 24. But if you want a solid college football game, then this is the one to play. One thing I enjoy about video game history is that through time when people made games, they would go out of their way for celebrity endorsements. If it wasn't for this game, I'd have no fucking clue who Hank Parker was, but apparently he's really good at catching fish. In the past, he won 2 Bassmaster Classic tournaments, so props to you, my guy. May your life be riveting and fulfilling as you bounce on the lake, drinking PBRs and catching fish. Now, you might see from the name of the game that this is a Black Bass entry. Black Bass was an incredible game on the NES, and that game in particular was a sequel to the Blue Marlin, which wasn't really that great. But I loved Black Bass, and it did make the top 10 for the previous installment of this series, which if you haven't watched, I'll go ahead and link down in the description and at the end of the video. In the game, we can fish in 3 different lakes and 1 river. It's really in-depth too. The lures matter, we can change our drag, we need to understand how bass behave because there are weather conditions that can affect your fishing. It's really well thought out. And while I usually don't bat an eye at fishing games, this is one that I can stand by. It's literally the black bass on the Super Nintendo, and I love it. One sport that is very well known that I have never really gotten into was basketball. Why? Because I'm a hockey fan. And between me and you, I was beyond disappointed that the one sport I understand through and through really didn't have any great games on the system. But there were some solid-ass basketball games, and the one that comes to mind for me is NBA Jam. He's heating up! Remember that sound? You're going to hear the announcer say it often when the computer-controlled players slap your ass around the court. I think most of us remember this game by the catchphrase, "He's on fire!" Or if you're like me, you remember seeing this in the arcade but not playing it. It's not a bad game. Literally every version I've played of NBA Jam for home consoles has been a great time. You just have to understand that it is an arcade game. It's not fair, but it's fun. In my humble opinion, for what it's worth, out of all of the games that handled 2-on-2 basketball, this was the one franchise that did it right, and in comparison to earlier midway basketball games, this one is palatable. The first 2 are TV basketball and arch rivals respectively, and while NBA Jam's foundation is a lot like arch rivals, it's incredibly more playable, trust me. There's also a tournament edition, but the only big change is that we have tournaments, so it's really up to you which version you want, or you could just play both. Did you know that there was another NBA Jam entry for the Super Nintendo? It's called NBA Hang Time, and much like the others, it's fun. Not as fun as NBA Jam, but still fun. I was never a big fan of golfing games. The closest I've ever come to actually sitting down and playing a golf game was Mario Golf when I was a kid, but that was only at my friend's house. When I went to Blockbuster consistently, it was rented out, so I never really had a chance to play it. However, when I was working on the sports library for the Super Nintendo, I was impressed by the simplicity of Hal's Hole-in-One. We don't really have a person whacking a ball, instead we have an eagle-eyed view of the course and we just hit a power bar. It's very simple, to the point, and one of the cooler things is that thanks to Mode 7, we can visualize the elevation. It's a solid golfing game that you should check out. Just understand it's not going to have all the bells and whistles like some of the other PGA games. This one surprised me. If you've watched my previous episodes, you know that like 90% of the time, I'm not a fan of games that originated on the Amiga and were ported to home consoles. A lot of what makes a game work on any PC of the era inevitably gets lost in translation, but that wasn't the case for Elite Soccer. This game was developed by Rage Software, who dedicated their lives from 1993 to 2003 working on various games, most notably the Saturn port of Doom, but a majority of their early works were soccer games. From 1992 to 1997, that's all that they worked on. Elite Soccer is one of those games, and if you've played this, you might recognize it as just Striker, because it's the same game with minimal quality of life improvements. We could choose from 5 different modes of soccer, pick from a large amount of teams, 128 in total, and I don't know, I just had good clean fun with it. One of the most popular sports games on the NES was Punch-Out! That's a series worth talking about one day. Arcade boxing that felt more like a rhythm game. In fact, you might argue that it is a rhythm game, and you could be right. I adored the first game, and I was interested to see exactly how the next entry would be. For a long time, I had never played it, so taking the time to check it out, I was impressed at just how much fun this game was for the short time that I played it. Much like the original Punch-Out, almost all of the key mechanics have transitioned, but there is one key mechanic that is kind of new, the power bar. In the first 2 iterations of Punch-Out in the arcades, which are named exactly the same, Little Mac has a power bar that allows for knockout hits. But I'm not the best at this game because I've never taken the time to play it outside of this episode, so I didn't really know how that KO bar worked, but I was impressed. I guess it's Nintendo, so for them to release a subpar game that previously existed on the NES wouldn't be good for business, right? So they knocked it out of the park. Again, it could be argued that this is just a rhythm game, but I was okay with placing it on this list. Historically, I've taken a 5-flush mega shit on LGN games. I have a right to. I was forced to play through tons of them, and many of them were wrestling games, and no, they weren't good. But that changed with WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, which actually caught me off guard. Now, there are 2 games that cover WrestleMania on the Super Nintendo. The first is WWF Super WrestleMania, and the other is just WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, the latter of which is obviously based on the 1995 arcade title. If you know anything about this era of wrestling licenses, you know Acclaim had bought LJN and began working with Midway quite extensively. In fact, you can recognize a 90s Midway game a mile away because they all tended to have the same art aesthetic. NBA Jam, Mortal Kombat 1 through 3, Killer Instinct, Cruisin', Revolution X, you name it, if Midway did it, it looked the same. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it because it offers some sense of realism in what we see. And it might sound simple, but it works. In the arcades, WrestleMania was a fun game, tremendous fun. The home console port, to me, maintains that same level of fun, and the only thing that sucks is that it omitted Yokozuna and Bam Bam Bigelow, and obviously a lot of the vocal samples because it is the Super Nintendo, and to me, that's where the Genesis version was slightly better. There was also a 32X version, and that one is probably one of the best games on the system, but that's not saying much for a console that only had 40 games. This is one worth playing though. A while back, I talked about this game. The exact episode was Top 10 Shortest Super Nintendo Games, which if you haven't watched, I'll go ahead and link it down below and at the end of this episode. It's a short game, and it's a really fun game. I had more fun with this than 90% of the basketball games on the system. At its core, it's very much an arcade game, and you can tell it's also very much inspired by NBA Jam, because they can heat up! Normally it's just a 2-player game, but if you manage to have the SNES multi-tap, which between me and you I've never seen in my life, then you can have up to 4 people playing. The usual suspects are involved, and we have the ability to use power-ups if we have the money to do so. We get the money by finding gems on the court, which are more prevalent if you turn up the wacky meter. The lower the wacky meter is, the less buffoonery there is. Turn it up, all bets are off. You'll have pies, laser guns, tons of bullshit that makes this game so much fun. Most Looney Tune games of the era were badass, and this is one that blended a childhood favorite TV show with sports, and it worked. A year later, Space Jam would come out. I know that this probably has nothing to do with it, but in my mind, I like to think in the meta that these guys were already familiar with basketball. Finally, Rare gets on this list. A lot of people don't think about Rare's game history and all that they've done, but their first game ever was a sports game, Slalom, on the NES. They did manage to sneak out a few sports games actually over time. They ported Quarterback from the arcade, California games, WWF WrestleMania, Super Off-Road, some games even on the Game Boy, but there was a noticeable lack of their contribution to the genre on the Super Nintendo. I guess in some ways I can give them a pass because they were working for Nintendo to get the Donkey Kong franchise up and running again. And of course they helped out with Battletoads games here and there as well. But Winning Run, that's a badass little game right there. It was the follow-up to Ken Griffey Jr. Major League Baseball, which, if you ask me, is an abhorrent piece of dog shit that had a nice little MLB logo stamped right in the middle of the turd. I couldn't get into it at all. But Winning Run not only looks good, sounds good, it also controls well, and the elements of batting and fielding are both excellently programmed. It's exemplary how Rare managed to crush baseball. Trust me, there's tons of baseball games on the Super Nintendo, and this is the best one to me. This one is interesting. Depending on where you lived, there was a different release. We knew this game as Riddick Bowe Boxing, but if you lived in Mexico, you might know this game as Chavez. And it does have an interesting development style as well. It starts with Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing, which had a sequel, Greatest Heavyweights, both created by Acme Interactive and both on the Genesis. Acme was then bought out by Malibu Comics to create Malibu Interactive, who proceeded to all but re-release the basic foundation of Greatest Heavyweights as Riddick Bowe Boxing. Now bear in mind, the only experience I've had with boxing that made me somewhat interested was Punch-Out. Even Super Punch-Out piqued my interest. I'm very judgmental about how boxing is represented, because I want it to be more than just a rock'em sock'em simulator, right? And between me and you, that's exactly how this game felt. But something about it gave me the warm and fuzzies while I was playing it. I actually enjoyed it. I think you might as well. Give it a shake. When I popped this in, I didn't know what I was getting into. What the fuck is a skins game? Well, I learned quickly. It's a golf term. Apparently, it's a betting thing. I wouldn't bet a penny on my golfing ability, so I guess it's some rich people thing, because I don't know anything about it. But let's talk about the game, because there's some really interesting history going on here. When I played this, I was dumbfounded at the game flow, the artwork, and just how fun this game was. It reminded me of another great golf game, Neo Turf Masters for the Neo Geo, like a lot, to the point where I was wondering if they just plagiarized the game. So I did a little research. Turns out the folks who developed the Irem skins game got tired of working with Irem, and they created their own company, Nazca Corporation, the creators of Metal Slug and, more importantly, Neo Turf Masters, even using the same development kits as before. That's awesome to me. The skins game started in the arcades though. It was known as Major Title and was only released in Japan. To me, it's the best golf simulation I've played to date, and the only comparable experience is one that was created by the exact same people, so hell yeah, this is definitely a game worth owning. We can choose 4 different golfers, each with their own abilities, there's 4 different game modes, and the interface is probably one of the most user-friendly I've seen in a while when it's time to tee off. Great game! And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of this list? Are there any sports games that stand out to you as the best on the Super Nintendo? Feel free to share your opinion in the comments section below. This is a chance to whip out some bragging rights about your favorite sports games and your memories as a kid, and I do read and respond to every single comment, even the mean ones. Also, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're a gathering of like-minded individuals that love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live, and if you align with that, then feel free to hit that subscription button. Finally, the single most important thing you could do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly affects the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.